Sisters and brothers in the Dhamma, Namo Buddhaya, Jai Bhim. So welcome everybody who's watching this, who's listening to this, to the Padmavajra Shrine Room for our weekly day retreat. Our day retreats are on Wednesdays, and as part of these day retreats we're exploring Shantideva's Bodhicaryavatara, that great 8th century text on the Bodhisattva's life, and we're having more meditation and silence in the afternoon. Satyaraja will be leading us in the development of the Bodhicitta meditation practice, and we'll be concluding the day with a puja after worshipping Dada Rinpoche's stupa. I particularly want to dedicate this, I'm dedicating this series of talks to Bhante, to Urgyen Sangharakshita. I'm offering them in honour of my teacher, but today's talk I also want to dedicate to Dr Babasaheb Ambedkar and to all of our Dharmacharis and Dharmacharinis and Mitras and Sahayaks and friends in India, in our Triratna community in India, because yesterday was Dr Ambedkar Jayanti. It was Dr Babasaheb Ambedkar Jayanti. So that's 14th of April was the day on which Babasaheb, Dr Ambedkar, was born, and every year there is a huge celebration of that, really rejoicing and celebrating Dr Ambedkar's birth, and of course his massive, inconceivably wonderful contribution to the uplift of the downtrodden, and culminating in the great mass conversion to Buddhism in Nagpur in 1956, along with hundreds of thousands of his followers. And he inaugurated, or he brought back, Buddhism as a living force to India, as Sangharakshita, as Bhante said in his book on Dr Ambedkar, Ambedkar and Buddhism, which is a really wonderful book. Dr Ambedkar did more for Buddhism in India since the Emperor Ashoka. And Bhante doesn't say those things lightly, but he did more for Buddhism in India since the Emperor Ashoka, because he brought back Buddhism to India after it had been lost for so many centuries as a living force. But as Dr Ambedkar said, Buddhism was alive spiritually in India, and he very much saw the conversion of the downtrodden to Buddhism as a return, as them returning to their true roots, their true heritage, if you like. It wasn't, in a sense, something new. It was the returning to what was originally theirs, but new in the sense of bringing about a revolution, a Dhamma revolution in India. So we, for one reason or another, we couldn't celebrate properly Dr Ambedkar's birthday yesterday, although I did look at YouTube and saw the different things going online by our Buddhist friends in India, and I'd like to salute you for that and thank you for what you were doing in India to celebrate Dr Ambedkar. I was imagining how frustrating it might have been for friends in India not to be able to publicly celebrate Dr Ambedkar's life, to be out there doing programs, karakrams, Dhamma programs and processions, and really, really celebrating. I was really feeling for you, because I've celebrated many Dr Ambedkar Jayantis when I lived in India many years ago now. Particularly I remember Ambedkar Jayantis in Mumbai and Nagpur. Massive celebrations from very early in the morning till very late at night, and sometimes, so I feel it's okay to mark Dr Ambedkar's Jayanti today, because sometimes, because we couldn't do all the programs that we were asked to do on the 14th of April, they carried on to the 15th of April. So I'd often be giving talks over several days around the time of Dr Ambedkar's Jayanti, and there's a tremendous atmosphere. Dr Ambedkar in India, among Buddhists, is described as a bodhisattva. If you go to a Dr. Ambedkar program of any kind, you often get the chant, Bodhisattva Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Ansa, and everybody replies, Vijayaso. Let's do this now. So you've all got to say after me, Vijayaso, really loudly. This is for our brothers and sisters in India. Bodhisattva Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Ansa. Vijayaso. May he conquer. May the Bodhisattva conquer. So this is really, really important. That wasn't bad the way you said that. It could be much louder, but we'll leave it there. But I know sometimes other Buddhist friends sometimes think, well, was he a bodhisattva? Had the Bodhicitta arisen? All that sort of thing. For me, that kind of language is irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. What you have in Babasaheb Ambedkar is a man who gave himself fully, completely, even sacrificed himself, I would say, to the uplift of the poor and the downtrodden, and who brought the Dharma back to India. He just gave his life completely to that. When you read Dr. Ambedkar's life, you just see a life of constant service, to his people. It's a very, very moving life. And when you live in India, and I remember very vividly a time when I was living in Bombay around the time of Babasaheb's Jayanti, having very vivid dreams of Dr. Ambedkar, because I was so immersed, not just in his life, but immersed in the way people spoke about Dr. Ambedkar, the devotion they had to Dr. Ambedkar, not just blind devotion, but really wanting to live according to the principles that he communicated. And Babasaheb had a deep feeling for the Bodhisattva vow in the Buddha in his Dhamma, which he was working on before, just at the moment of his death. He quoted right at the end of Buddha in his Dhamma, it's the second from last of the pieces at the end, a vow, who calls it a vow to spread his Dhamma, a vow to spread the Buddha's Dhamma. And it's actually, it's a sort of reworking of the 4 Bodhisattva vows, the great vows that you find in East Asian Buddhism. There are beings without limit. Let us take the vow to give them all across to the other shore. There are depravities in us without number. Let us take the vow to extinguish them all. There are truths without end. Let us take the vow to comprehend them all. There is the way of Buddha without comparison. Let us take the vow to accomplish it perfectly. So there, right at the end of his magnum opus, you have the 4 great Bodhisattva vows, and he had a deep feeling for the Bodhisattva ideal, Babasaheb, and one of his first, I think even his first Buddhist publications was a Buddhist puja book, where he gave the mantra Om Mani Padme Hung, the mantra of the great Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the Mahakarunaka, the greatly compassionate one. And he used to recite that mantra apparently regularly. And he's told one of the people who was one of his assistants that it was chanting Om Mani Padme Hung that was keeping him alive for the great work of conversion, because towards the end Dr. Ambedkar was a very, very sick man indeed. In 1917, Dr. Ambedkar was in the princely state of Baroda, which is now Vadodara in Gujarat state in Western India. He was 26 years old, and he'd gone to Baroda to work in the service of the Maharaja of Baroda, who was a very progressive king, very progressive Maharaja, who'd sponsored Dr. Ambedkar for his studies in Britain and the United States. And Dr. Ambedkar had returned to Baroda to work in the service of the government. So he's 26, he's one of the most highly qualified men in India, and it's a great shock for him. He'd been treated just as a fellow human being in the West. In his studies, he'd done brilliantly. When he got to Baroda, even though he was one of the most outstanding minds of his generation, he was continued to be treated as an untouchable. Clerks would throw files at him in his office rather than give them to him. He wasn't allowed to take water in the government offices. Even trying to stay anywhere was a problem. He couldn't find lodgings. In fact, he stayed in a Parsi guest house, and the Parsis drove him out with sticks. So even Parsis, the Zoroastrian community, were practicing caste, or they were under the influence of their Hindu brothers and sisters, and treating him as an untouchable. And he decided that he just had to leave the service of the Maharaja of Baroda and make his own way. And he went to a park in Baroda to wait for his train. And he felt terrible. He describes this in a set of autobiographical writings called Waiting for a Visa. The waiting for a visa is a visa to his own country. It's not a real visa. He's using the language poetically. And he said he just was sitting there weeping, his mind blank, wondering what on earth he was going to do with his life. This highly educated, brilliant man, a stranger, a foreigner, an untouchable in his own country, wanting to serve the country. And as he sat there thinking, he thought of his father, he thought of his family, he thought of his mother, he thought of his brothers and sisters, and he thought of all of the untouchables, that's the word he uses, in India, and the suffering they were undergoing, like him, on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And he took a great resolve at that time that he was going to work for their uplift. It's called Dr Ambedkar's Babasaheb's Mahasankalpa. Dr Babasaheb Ambedkar's Mahasankalpa, his great resolve, his great resolution that he was going to devote his life to the upliftment of his people in all kinds of ways, in every way possible. It's rather like a Bodhisattva vow. This young man, completely alone, 26 years old, and the tide is turning. He's turning fully towards being completely wedded with, if you like, the destiny of the Dalit people, untouchable people. So he made this great resolution, which in the end culminates in the great mass conversion in 1956 to the Dharma, to Buddhism. The great going for refuge and taking of vows, which symbolized the movement of his people to the Dharma. Because Dr Ambedkar realized very, very early on in his struggle was that if there was to be real change in India, in the country, you could, yes, outlaw untouchability, which the Indian constitution does. You can have all sorts of positive laws, if you like, positive discrimination to bring about the uplift of the people. But you have also got to change consciousness, to change culture, because the discrimination will still go on, the atrocities will still go on. You've got to change the culture. You've got to bring about the end of caste. You've got to bring about the end of the graded system of inequality, as he describes it. And that means a religious conversion, a turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness. And he saw that Buddhism was the most liberated of all religions, for all sorts of reasons, which he goes into, but not least because it is concerned with the individual working with the community, taking full responsibility for their lives, for its life. He said at the great mass conversion, in the great conversion speech, "I feel liberated from hell through this conversion. I feel liberated from hell." That's the way he felt about it. And this was a man of great qualifications, great standing. He could have lived any life he wanted to live. But leaving the hell of caste and going into what he called the atmosphere of liberation of the Buddha's Dhamma, There was the liberation. There was the culmination of his work, and he urged his people to work for the Dhamma from then on. It's a very inspiring life, a very wonderful life. And yes, so that's why I fully subscribe to the view that Dr Ambedkar is a great Bodhisattva who really lived for others in the most practical of ways. So I'm offering this talk to Dr Babasaheb Ambedkar. I'm offering this talk to my brothers and sisters in India, to my friends in India. I've mentioned their vows, the Bodhisattva vows, and that's going to be the concern of our talk today in our exploration of Shantideva's Bodhicaryavatara. We're coming to the Bodhisattva vow, the Pranidhi Chitta, the Bodhisattva vows. So the last talk we talked a lot about, we explored a lot about worship, to do with worship, to do with puja. You remember those incredible offerings that Shantideva makes, very, very lavish and sensual offerings. I think one of the points I didn't make last week was that sometimes reading Buddhist texts, you can have this idea that the senses, in a sense, don't have a place. You've got to sort of go beyond the senses, or the senses are dangerous. But there's another way of looking at that, and is that the senses and the experience through the senses can be offered. All the most beautiful things in existence are offered up and put at the service of the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, of the Dharma and the Sangha. Before this talk, I was walking in our beautiful garden in the silence with all the trees in blossom, in this sort of paradise that we're living in at the moment at Padmavajra, although very aware of the great shadow of the coronavirus and how it's affecting everybody throughout the world, and hearing stories about that. Nonetheless, we are in very, very beautiful conditions. Well, all of this is offered. All of this is offered up to the crystallizations, as it were, of the Bodhicitta, of the heart of wisdom, of compassion, the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. So yes, all this beauty, we take along the path with us, as it were. We offer it up to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and to the work of the Bodhisattva. So this is the way puja begins. This is the way the sevenfold puja begins. It's this mood of worship. Sangharakshita Bhante talks about the sevenfold puja brilliantly as a sequence of seven devotional moods which bring about the arising of the bodhicitta. He really believes that. He says if you do the sevenfold puja enough, and if you do it deeply enough, and if you meditatively enter the different moods that are being evoked, well, that will, as it were, attract the bodhicitta. So first of all, there's worship. There's this tremendous emotional involvement in the beauty of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And then there's vandana, saluting, prostrating, bowing down, realizing the vast gulf between you and the Bodhisattvas and the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. You really feel that in the vandana section. Nonetheless, you go for refuge. You still want to go on the great journey of moving in the direction of enlightenment. You want to follow the path to that enlightenment with the great disciples and with the Bodhisattvas. So you go for refuge, you make that pledge, that commitment, and then you enter the mood of confession. We talked quite a lot about that last week, the mood of confession. We looked at Shantideva's very intense confession, very sober confession. This letting go of, this pointing out and revealing all of those dark things in the way of living fully in accordance with the bodhicitta. Chapter 3, which is where we're going to begin today, is Bodhicitta Parigraha. We've got this word graha again, taking hold of. Parigraha can be translated as fully embracing, fully taking to heart the bodhicitta. So taking it even more into the heart. And the mood of the puja, the moods of the puja turns from confession into rejoicing. The rejoicing in merits, the punyana modana, rejoicing in the shubha, that's the word that Shantideva uses, the good, the beautiful acts done by all beings, and rejoicing in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, rejoicing in the Bodhisattvas, rejoicing in the Bodhicitta, rejoicing in the aspirations of all the great Bodhisattvas. You just get into this mood of delighting in the good done by all beings, in the good that is everywhere. So you enter into that mood. And then from that mood, you move to entreating. This urgent, this adhyeshana yachana. It's not just receptivity, but it's this urgent appeal and entreaty for the Buddhas not to leave us, not to depart, to stay, and for them to teach and communicate the Dharma to us. So these are the 6 of the devotional moods of the puja that we enter. Sometimes it's good to do the sevenfold puja as a kind of meditation, where you sort of meditate on each mood. And this is a very Indian way of looking at things. You get this notion of bhava, rasa and bhava in Indian aesthetics and later devotional literature, where you enter these moods as you move in the direction of reality itself. So in treaty, we're really opening up to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and this all leads to the transference of merit and self-surrender. This is where all this emerges into. This is moving towards the actual taking of the Bodhisattva vow in Shantideva's text. May the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. So all of the good, all of the punya, all of the positive atmosphere that we've generated through dwelling in these moods, not just in a ceremony, in a ritual, but in our life generally, all of our good actions, everything that we've developed, we give it away. We give it away to alleviate the sufferings of all beings. And Shantideva goes even beyond that. The next verse, what Sangharakshita has done in our sevenfold puja, he's selected a few verses in the transference of merit section. The next verse in Shantideva's text is, may I be medicine for the sick. May I be their doctor and their nurse until sickness is no more. And how important that verse is at this time. Sangharakshita, in fact, says, I'll go into this perhaps a bit later, that the arising of the Bodhicitta is not really about arising in one person. It's something that arises in a community. It's something that you're connecting with throughout the whole of life. And of course, we're connected with people who are indeed doctors and nurses, alleviating the sickness in the world, especially at the moment. So we connect with them through a verse like this. And it goes on in this way. Shantideva making aspirations, not just dedicating his merit, but in a way seeing pictures of how he can be, becoming food and drink for living beings, and so on and so forth. And it leads, in the end, to total surrender. My personality throughout my existences. The word for personality is Atma, self. Shantideva has no problem with using the word self at all. Myself, my Atma, my personality, throughout all my becomings, my bhavas, all existences, in the times to come, I give up without regard to myself. All of my possessions, all of my merit, I just give it up without any concern for myself. This is what the puja, what our Buddhist practice is aiming for. This is what it's directed towards. I mean, it seems incredible, doesn't it, what's being asked of us here when we really contemplate it. And it's easy to say these words. I mean, we say these words probably every day at the end of our meditations and pujas. But we have to really feel them. We have to really, as it were, believe them we have to be prepared, to give up absolutely everything. And the next verse gives us a very vivid picture of what that might look like. The next verses go like this, 11 to 16. The abandonment of all is nirvana, and nirvana is my heart's goal. If I must give up everything, then it is better to be given to beings. Let me give my body to them to do with as they wish. Let them continually beat it, insult it, and splatter it with filth. Let them play with my body. Let them be derisive and amuse themselves. Since I have given this body to them, why should I care what they do with it? Let them do what they like, whatever brings them pleasure, but let them suffer no misfortune because of me. Let them hate me, let them love me, but whatever they're feeling for me, let it bring about all that they desire. Let them wrong me, let them mock me, let them accuse me falsely, but let them share in enlightenment. These must be some of the most profound verses in, not just Buddhist literature, but in all of, if you like, religious literature, to use that language. Very easy for me to say, impossible to imagine. One of the things we've got going on here, I think, is Shantideva, one of his almost devices, it's not a device because you can feel the heart in this, but one of the things he does, he's not content to describe the transference of merits and the life of self-surrender. He gives you a picture of what that looks like, a very extreme picture. He does this a lot in the Bodhicaryavatara. He creates these almost extreme, vivid pictures of what it looks like to be selfless. He's very, very good like that. It's very easy when you study a text like this to think, this is just rhetoric. He's just making a point really strongly. But no, what he's doing, he's saying, this is what selflessness could look like. This might need to happen. He's also making another point right at the beginning. The abandonment of all is nirvana, and nirvana is my heart's goal. The word for abandonment is sarvatyaga, parityaga. Tyaga is the word for renunciation. So this is what nirvana actually is. Nirvana is indeed the abandoning, the renouncing, the surrendering of absolutely everything. This is a very traditional way of looking at it. Nirvana is total renunciation. All Buddhist schools would agree with this. If you're seriously interested in attaining nirvana, that means the total abandoning of your conditioned self and everything that goes with it. That's what nirvana is. There's a wonderful kind of passage in Bhante's lecture, Enlightenment as Experience and as Non-Experience, where he does this critique of the language of experience and pointing out how the language of experience is highly problematic and doesn't really correspond to anything in traditional Buddhist literature, fascinating in itself. But he says, you could say nirvana is the experience to end all experiences. That rather reminded me of this business of nirvana is the abandoning, the renunciation of everything. Nirvana is the experience to end all experiences, because experience is operating within the conditioned subject-object framework, while nirvana is right out and beyond all that. But just in case you're concerned of that might open up nihilism, when he talks about what does enlightenment as non-experience, what's the language that's used to describe enlightenment as a non-experience, what does he do? He quotes the Dhammapada, Nibbānam paramang sukham. Nirvana is the supreme bliss. There's no mention of the word experience in that. It's not that in nirvana you experience bliss. Nirvana is the supreme bliss, but a bliss beyond subject and object, beyond self and other framework. So nirvana is the renunciation of everything. And nirvana is my heart's goal, says Shantideva. The word goal is artha, which means goal, meaning. The whole meaning of my life, the whole meaning of my heart's life is realizing nirvana, realizing enlightenment, attaining, to use that language, enlightenment. But it's the abandoning of all. And if I'm to abandon everything, better that I give it to beings. My whole life and everything that goes with it, better that it's given to beings. You could even say, there is no abandoning unless there is a giving away. It's very easy to talk about how non-attached we are and, oh, I don't need this and I don't need that. But what about when it's still sort of available to you? But if you give it away, it's gone. The other has it. It's not yours anymore. So better, if I'm to abandon everything, better to give it means it's the only way to abandon. In other words, there is only a Dhamma life for others, with others. There's no other kind of Dhamma life. If you're not giving away, perhaps you're not giving up. Maybe this is something to really think about. We can kid ourselves that we're non-attached when we're not really. We need to be thinking in terms of giving away rather than giving up. It's very interesting in this. I was looking in in a text yesterday, an 8-session mind training text by the great Drumtunpa, the great disciple of Atisha. And he talks about mind training in terms of the elements, and he describes a kind of element meditation, a bit like our 6-element meditation, where the elements aren't just given up and let go of. You imagine giving them away. You can see what he's doing. He's turning the transference of merits and self-surrender section from Shantideva's text into a visualization. That all of the elements that make up his body, the earth, the water, the fire, the air, they're imagined as being given away as food and drink and everything else to living beings. They're gone and given. You have this practice, which is sort of popular among some people, the the cutting off practice, where you imagine your body chopped up and given to all sorts of demons. This is called the Kusali's offering. Kusali meaning a beggar. It's really only a practice if you've already given everything up. It's not really a practice, I think, to do in your bedroom or something like that, although people do that. It's really the Bodhisattva's practice of giving away, being willing to give away everything. These exercises, these meditations are there to turn us into Bodhisattvas. You're giving up, you're giving away. Abandoning, and nirvana is the abandoning of self and giving away to others. This is something that that Bhante's talked about so often. Just to reference the seminar on the bitendential value of being, where he really goes into that Dharma life is about giving up and giving away. You're not doing it for yourself. Doesn't mean that you exclude yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to your genuine needs because you're one of the living beings, but you're thinking much more in terms of giving away and giving up. And as I say, Shantideva does this thing of creating a scenario, a very extreme scenario of giving up my body to beings so that they can do anything with it. Anything with it. He talks about being accused falsely, of being wronged and being mocked, of being beaten, of being covered in filth. This isn't masochism. This is very, very important to understand. It's not sort of, you can imagine doing this in a very egotistical kind of way to draw attention to yourself. That's not what he's getting at. what he's trying to show is that this might happen. That's the way I read it. You might get into situations, where you're very, very deeply, as it were, challenged. If you are going to live a life of really doing something for others, it could well bring you into serious conflict with other people. And I've talked about Dr Ambedkar's life. Dr Ambedkar's life is a life of constant humiliation, or people attempting to humiliate him. Constant opposition, from all of the forces in Indian society. And he never gives up. He never gives up his service. It doesn't matter about the insults, the threats to his people. He carries on with the work of uplift. If you like, perhaps it's better to think, when we think of this, it's not that one's retreating into a sort of a sub-self, as it were, and rubbing yourself out in that masochistic, nihilistic way. When the bodhicitta arises, when the bodhicitta is present, you're just too big. You're just too vast. So it looks as though you've lost. It looks as though you've been destroyed, but you haven't been. Because you've never let go of the bodhicitta. And you want for those people, even those people who are harming you, you want enlightenment for them. May they share in enlightenment. This is extraordinary. This is extraordinary. It's very easy for me to talk about this, to expound this. The reality is, when I'm faced with it, that's a very different thing. I'm very, very touchy. I have to say about myself, very, very touchy for any kind of hint of criticism of myself. Very, very touchy about that. I'm miles and miles away from this kind of vision that Shantideva has offered. I remember talking to Sangharakshita Tabanti just before he died, and I was aware he was having critical things about him being read to him. And I asked him, why? Why are you doing that? I said, I'd hate that. I'd find that so difficult. Why are you doing it? And he said, well, I don't really mind what people say about me. I don't care anymore what people say about me. That doesn't matter anymore. But I care about the order. And I want to know the worst so that I'm aware of what the order needs. So I asked him, well, how did you train in not being concerned about what people think of you and what people say about you? And he said, well, when I was a young man, when I just took this precept that when I was praised, I'd reflect, next time I'll be blamed. And when I was blamed, I'd reflect, next time I'll be praised. So I just got used to the fluctuating worldly winds, and never deflecting from his great work of communicating the Dharma. So we really do need to, what Shantideva is sort of giving to us here is we really need to sort of toughen up in our Dharma practice. Whatever's done to us, if you like, we don't worry about that. We're not concerned about that. What we're concerned about is living for nirvana, living for enlightenment, and that people are connecting with enlightenment. This is the great vow of Shantideva, and it's completely indiscriminate. It's for all beings. I remember, and I think one of the things that it's worth reflecting on here is the limits of our consciousness, the limits of our loving kindness, the limits, if you like, of our compassion, the limits of who we're prepared to communicate the Dharma to. I remember being it was a very humiliating experience of being shown my limits. I remember it happened regularly after finishing a Guhyaloka course. Up at Guhyaloka on the ordination courses, for 4 months, we'd recite these verses, sometimes every night. Nirvana is the abandoning of all, and my heart yearns for nirvana. If I'm to give up everything, let me give it to beings, dedicating the merit to all beings. I feel so inspired and so moved. And then we'd go and get the plane at Alicante airport. It's high summer, standing in a queue. And in the queue, there are lots of people going home from their holidays, and they're sunburnt, and they look miserable, and they're shouting at their children, and it's really unpleasant and crude. And I always used to find, when that would happen to me, I confess, a terrible misanthropy overwhelming me, a real sort of ill will to mankind. And then I'd be like this. And of course, then I'd think of all these verses I'd been doing up at Kukuloka. I hadn't been saying, may the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings, except those people I'm going to meet at Alicante airport, and him and her and all the rest of it. No, I wasn't saying that. It was all beings, a wonderful abstraction. But these are the people. These are the people I'm meeting straight after the retreat. And of course, then I'd look again and you'd see the suffering. You'd see the suffering etched on their faces. Maybe the holiday hadn't gone too well. Maybe they didn't want to go home. But you could see that they were in pain in one way or another. Well, some of them actually look quite happy. But, this is what Shantideva is getting at, that this is for everybody. This Dharma is for everybody. This is what the Bodhisattva is concerned with. He then has, as it were, visions after this of service. It could, as I say, sound as if this is masochistic and nihilistic. You're just wiping yourself out. He's not saying that, because he then has these, as it were, visions of service. I would be a protector for those without protection, a guide for those who wander, a boat, a bridge, a causeway for those who long for the other shore. May I be a lamp for those needing a lamp. May I be a bed for those in need of rest. For all embodied beings, may I be a slave for those in need of a slave. And he goes on in this way. It's all these visions of how he can be, and you can take them literally, you can take them symbolically. He needs to change himself, turn himself into somebody who can light up the darkness for others, who can show the way to those who are lost, who can, provide the bridge across the river of samsara, and so on. Of course, Shantideva knows full well that the ultimate gift is giving the Dharma to living beings, but he doesn't want to exclude anything. And of course, he has the all lifetimes to make this dedication. Just being prepared to do whatever is needed to bring about the welfare of others. Sangharashta talks about the end of the path as spontaneous, compassionate activity. And when he described what spontaneous, compassionate activity looks like, he said, you do what needs to be done. That's all he said. What we're training for as Buddhists is to purify ourselves, transform ourselves, so that we do what needs to be done. Whatever is presented to us, there is nothing, whoever is presented to us, there is nothing between us and what needs to be done to bring about the end of suffering for that person. There's no fear, there's no doubt, there's no aversion, there's no attachment. We do what needs to be done. That's what we're training for. And he goes on in this way. And then we come to verses which describe the taking of the Bodhisattva vow itself, the commitment to the Bodhisattva vow. Gampopa, in his Jewel of Liberation, says this is a tradition of taking the vow. This is Shantideva's tradition of taking the vow. So he says, as the Sugatas, the Buddhas of ancient times, grasped this bodhicitta, embraced this bodhicitta, in the same way as they progressed in the bodhisattva training, so shall I generate utpada, develop. So shall I generate the bodhicitta for the welfare of the world, and I too shall train in those bodhisattva precepts in regular order, step by step, thoroughly, completely. I will follow the training of the Bodhisattva, just like the Buddhas of the past. The wise one who seizes that bodhicitta with serene faith, serene confidence, should continue to encourage his resolve so that the bodhicitta will grow and thrive in this way. And then you get these wonderful verses. Today, my birth has borne fruit, and my human life is well obtained. Today I am reborn into the Buddha family, the Buddha Kula, and I am now a son of the Buddha, a Buddha Putra. And now I must live up to my birth, and by my actions place no stain upon that spotless family, just as a blind man may find by chance a priceless jewel in a heap of refuse, so somehow this bodhicitta has arisen even in me. Incredibly beautiful verses. So one of the things I want to bring out here is that committing to the Bodhisattva path, taking the Bodhisattva vow, giving rise to the bodhicitta, is seen as a spiritual rebirth. We are reborn now, a son of the Buddha. We're in a different family now. And of course, this is reflected very strongly in our own ordination ceremony, that when we're ordained, we go for refuge and we are given a Dhamma name, a Dharma name. And that indicates, well, we've entered a different family now, the Dhamma family now. And this way of thinking, of committing to the Dharma life in these terms, pledging to live the Dharma life, this great change in our lives, it goes right back to the earliest traditions of Buddhism. The Buddha himself says on one occasion, "Monks, you are sons of my mouth, born of my mouth." Amazing expression, sons of my mouth, born of my mouth. In other words, born of the Dhamma. You are heirs of the Dhamma, not heirs of worldly things. Really making it clear, look, there's going to be a big difference now. Life is not the same anymore. This is a new life. This is a Dhamma life, not a worldly life. We have the whole teaching in where the Buddha likens the Dhamma to the great and mighty ocean, where he says that just as the rivers of India, the Ganges, the Yamuna, the Sarasvati, and so on, just as they flow into the great ocean and lose their names, Ganges and so on, in the same way, when people from the four castes enter my order, they lose their caste names, and they are known now simply as sons of the Sakyan. In other words, sons and indeed daughters of the Buddha. You're no longer associated with any caste identity. You are a Dhamma-farer, living that life. Caste, those kinds of distinctions do not obtain anymore. All that has gone. And we find this reflected as well, strongly asserted in Dr Ambedkar's 22 great vows, which he gave at the time of the great mass conversion, after giving the refuges and precepts. He gave these vows to sort of really guarantee the purity of the conversion, the purity of the going for refuge. They involve the complete renunciation of Hindu practices and pure following of the Buddha's Dhamma. But towards the end, I think the last vow goes something like, I believe by adopting Buddhism, I am having a rebirth. I believe by adopting Buddhism, I am having a rebirth. You can imagine how powerful that is. How powerful that is for people who've been treated as untouchable. You know, that they've been defined since birth as outcast, as impure, for no other reason but just for the family they've been born into. But not now. I believe by adopting Buddhism, I am having a rebirth. I'm a Buddhist now. I'm a son, a daughter of the Buddha. This is a new life. And there's tremendous freedom with that. I remember talking to Buddhists in India, Indian Buddhist friends of mine who were there at the time of the Great Conversion, who were around. I said, well, what was it like? And they said two things. First of all, they said, well, actually, it made our life a bit difficult at first because we were boycotted in our village. Hindu traders would not serve us. We had to go miles and miles to get our food because how dare we become Buddhist? How dare we take charge of our life? I said, but that must have been so difficult. And they said, well, yes, but in a way, no, because we felt so free. We felt liberated because of what we'd done, because of Baba Saheb. Our lives were our own, even though there was still all this hardship. And of course, with Buddhist friends in India, there's a great pride in a positive sense of being a Buddhist, being a son, a daughter of the Buddha, a healthy human pride. And of course, this comes out in Shantideva's texts. Today my birth has borne fruit, and my human life is well obtained. Today I am reborn into the Buddha family, and I am now a son of the Buddha. A son of the Buddha. So tremendous positive pride, a sense of lineage, the lineage of Bodhicitta, the lineage of this force of wisdom and compassion in the world. That's what Shantideva is identifying with. That's what we identify with when we go for refuge. That's what we identify with when the Bodhicitta arises. And a very, very positive sense of pride. I think this is a sort of area, in a way, that Buddhists in the West can be a bit nervous about. You know, almost a bit apologetic about their Buddhism, and you don't want to be triumphalist. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about dignity and self-respect. In his conversion speech, Dr Ambedkar said, those who wish to come under the refuge of the Buddha, to go for refuge to the Buddha, must do so after counting the cost, because it is a religion very, very difficult to practice. He said, we have founded this, we've made this movement of conversion for dignity and self-respect. What he was addressing was people even in his own community who didn't want there to be the conversion because of the loss of material comfort. And addressing them, Dr Ambedkar, you get told a whole story about, prostitutes in the red light district in Bombay, calling out, oh, Suleiman, bring keema, bring roti, bring chai, getting up late in the morning and, living on lamb curry, minced lamb curry and chapatis and sweet tea. My impression is that he's comparing his followers who wanted material comfort to just selling themselves. And he said, but our women are not like that. Our women are content to eat bakri and shengdana chutney. Bakri is a kind of country chapati made of millet flour, and shengdana chutney is ground peanut with a bit of spice in it. Just that, very, very simple food. He said, our struggle is for dignity and self-respect, not for material gain. Extraordinary. Dr Ambedkar could be like this in his speech. It's very, very pungent Marathi, very, very powerful, really getting into the hearts of people, which people loved and appreciated, so deeply. Well, it's true for us. Our struggle in Dhamma life is for dignity and self-respect. So we don't give in, to our negative emotions. We don't give in to our defilements. We don't give in to our small-mindedness. We don't give in to our meanness. Whatever the challenge, we don't take the shortcuts just to make ourselves comfortable. We live this Dhamma life with dignity, with full dignity, developing ourselves, going beyond ourselves, leading the Dhamma life for the benefit of others. That's the way we live this life. This is Buddha pride in our lineage. We talk about spiritual rebirth in our movement, spiritual death and rebirth, but you have to be reborn from something. You're not just reborn out of nothing. You're reborn from the blessing of the Buddhas. You're in a new lineage now. I remember Mr. Chen talking about this practice in Vajrayana tradition of Buddha pride, Vajra pride, the pride of identifying with the deity. And he explained it very, very well, what it really means. He said, supposing your meditation practice is Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of great compassion, you're identifying with the greatly compassionate one. Supposing then you're walking along and you have a mean thought, an ungenerous thought, you immediately think, oh, I'm Avalokiteshvara. I'm not supposed to do that. Mr. Chen explained things very beautifully, very simply. And in that way, you get rid of that mean thought by identifying with the positive, identifying with, in this case, great compassion. And then there is incredible gratitude and thankfulness in Shantideva's text. After expressing all the pride of living up to this great tradition, really wanting to live from it fully, he says, just as a blind man may find by chance a priceless jewel in a heap of refuse, so somehow this bodhicitta has arisen even in me. Even in me. It's not that Shantideva is sort of doing himself down here, or perhaps he is. I get the impression that he was a man who was so absorbed in his Buddhist practice, so absorbed in it, he was forgetting all about any kind of attainment. As far as he was concerned, he was just concentrating on what he needed to do, to change, to transform, very aware of his shortcomings, and just fully absorbed. So there's this sense of something miraculous in the presence of the bodhicitta, in the presence of this force of wisdom and compassion which has somehow come into his life. He is like refuse, he is like rubbish, just cast aside, on the roadside. And yet there is a jewel, this magnificent jewel of bodhicitta that he's found. It's miraculous. Bhante, in his exploration of the Bodhicaryavatara, goes into this a bit. If I can find the passage. I wanted to find this passage. Yes. So in 1973, Bhante did this seminar on the Bodhicaryavatara, which has come out as The Endlessly Fascinating Cry. And in 1973, very, very early days of the movement. And if you read the seminar, there's quite a lot of the flavour of the early days, but there's some wonderful insights there that throughout it, coming from Bhante. And he talks about thanksgiving. First of all, he says this: there's a lot more positive feeling repressed than we think. We mustn't always think that what is repressed is negative. Quite often we repress the better side of ourselves, not the worst. Some forms of psychology have accustomed us to thinking that whatever is repressed is something nasty and negative, but I don't think this is true at all. There's at least as much good repressed, in some case maybe more good than bad. People are in many cases better than they look, better than they behave. Give them half a chance, as on retreat, and they start coming out. You can see a lot of goodness underneath. Not all sorts of nasty, dirty little things squirming underneath that black stone, as it were. On the contrary, you can see some very good, beautiful things that don't get a chance to emerge, including the sense of gratitude and thanksgiving. Another feature of Dr Ambedkar's insight into the fate of his people in India. He said, by denying people a human life, you're creating a powder keg in India. That was his warning to caste Hindus, because so much good is repressed. So much goodness can't find expression. One of the things that we really have to do as Buddhists, as order members, as mitras, as friends, is to create the good so that people can express the good. So Bhante says this about this verse of finding the jewel in a heap of refuse. When he insists on thanksgiving, Shantideva puts his finger on something very important. Maybe there wasn't enough of it even in the Buddhist world of his day, and therefore he emphasized it. But of course, we mustn't just mechanically recite the appropriate words of the sevenfold puja without really trying to feel them in the way that he apparently did. Thanksgiving is an integral part of the spiritual life. Thanksgiving for the very idea that one might become enlightened, for the fact that there is such a possibility even. Perhaps in some cases we don't feel really thankful because we're not completely convinced that there are these glorious possibilities. And it's a very beautiful way of describing it. Thanksgiving, not just gratitude, but thanksgiving for the very possibility of enlightenment, the very possibility of the bodhicitta. So often we can emphasize the negative. So often there's this pervading cynicism, in the world. But we need greater and greater thanksgiving in relation to the good, and greater thanksgiving in our lives that we have the possibility of living from and for the bodhicitta. In the remaining verses of this section, and I must start bringing my talk to an end, Shantideva describes the bodhicitta as the elixir of life, which destroys death in the world, an inexhaustible treasure alleviating all poverty in the world, the supreme medicine, curing the world's sickness, a tree of rest for weary beings wandering on the road of existence. It's a bridge for all travellers to pass over the waters of bad rebirth. It's the heart's waxing moon, cooling the heat of the fever of the defilements. It is a great sun, dispelling the darkness of the world's ignorance. It is fresh butter, churned from the milk of the true Dharma. As I said earlier, his verses describe so many ways in which the bodhicitta expresses and the way he's going to live for the benefit of beings. And again, in this 1973 seminar, Bhante was already discussing this whole area, opening up this whole area of the bodhicitta arising in a community rather than being a vow taken by one person. So just listen to this. It's not that someone gets bodhisattva ordination. It's much more like, in a way, the whole order getting it. How? One doesn't just know it. One just doesn't know at present. But it is certainly much more like that. It might be focused, as it were, in certain individuals, but it really concerns the order, even the movement as a whole. In a way, the movement embodies the bodhicitta, or at least is an embodiment or manifestation of the bodhicitta. If there is no bodhicitta in the movement, then it's just another organization. If there is no bodhicitta in the movement, then it's just another organization. So that to the extent that there is a sort of bodhicitta at work in the movement, to that extent it's a real Buddhist movement. A real Buddhist movement. Otherwise not. That's really why we have our sevenfold puja. The sevenfold puja is working up towards the bodhicitta, as is suggested right at the end. If you do the puja often enough and with sufficient sincerity, sooner or later, for all those who do it, the bodhicitta descends or arises, whatever you like to call it. But I think it's more likely to arise in the case of a number of people working hard together and stimulating and sparking one another off, rather than for the solitary individual, in whose case it may tend to be more like an individual experience in the narrow sense. At the same time, it's not a collective thing in the sense of a product of mass psychology. We don't really have a word for it. It's more a matter of fellowship or a manifestation of spiritual communion. Beautiful words, way, way back in the 1970s. But look at that. We're not really a Buddhist movement unless the bodhicitta is amongst us, unless the force of wisdom and compassion for the full manifestation of wisdom and compassion is amongst us. Whether we're here at Padmavajra on retreat, whether we're in India working for the Dharma in India, whether we're in the cities, the great cities throughout the world, wherever we may be, we are not a Buddhist order, we are not a Buddhist movement unless the Bodhicitta is powerful among us, surging amongst us. A few final words. The end of this section has two wonderful verses, which I really love. My friends will laugh and be amused at why I love these verses, because they know my love of food, one of my many great weaknesses. For the caravan of famished beings, wandering the road of existence, hungry for the enjoyment of happiness, this is a feast of happiness, offered as refreshment to all who come. Today, I invite the world to Buddhahood and to all worldly happiness meanwhile, in the presence of all the protectors, all the Buddhas, all the Bodhisattvas. May gods, Titans and all rejoice. I love this. I love that Shantideva concludes his verses on the Bodhisattva as describing the Bodhisattva's gift as the greatest possible feast offering to the caravan of famished beings, hungry for happiness, a great feast. I really love that. It makes it very, very clear that a Bodhisattva is hugely generous. And as I said before, as Bhante said, without the Bodhicitta, the order, the movement is not really a Buddhist order and movement. We need to be lords of the feast. In the first chapter, Shantideva describes the Bodhisattva as the Satrapati, the Lord of the feast offering. So a Bodhisattva provides a great feast, great abundance for living beings, great abundance, a great feast of Dharma, a great feast of friendship, a great feast of fellowship, a great feast of love, a great feast of care and attention. When people come into our community, when they come to our centres, they should feel that they're being welcomed into a great feast. Buddhists should have this quality of abundance, of wealth. And I say this fully mindful of the great feasts I used to enjoy in India, especially on Ambedkar Jayanti. On Ambedkar Jayanti, I wouldn't just be given talks, I'd be invited to people's homes and houses, and there'd be this wonderful hospitality. The women of the house, because it was usually the women of the house that would do this, with great pride, I must add, not any sense of servitude, but with great pride. They'd cook all the wonderful Indian delicacies, all the wonderful curries and dals and breads. Maybe it would be puran poli, wonderfully stuffed, chapatis stuffed with sweet chickpea flour, chickpea and jaggery, all mashed together, stuffed into a paratha and covered in ghee, and which you dip in warm milk. Oh, what a feast that would be. And there'd always be disappointment when I could only manage about 2 and at the most 3. And even that was being greedy. That wasn't very much, according to my friends. But it wasn't just the wonderful food, it was the atmosphere of love, the atmosphere of real welcome and friendship and love, this tremendous sense of a feast, knowing that they also wanted to hear the feast of the Dharma, the feast of the Sangha, that we would be giving later when we do the Dharma talk. So let's be this, not just for one another, not just for the people we're meeting, but for the sake Yes, indeed, impossible though it may sound, the sake of all beings in all lifetimes, let's be the lords and indeed the ladies of the feast offering of the Dharma that brings the highest, the greatest, the ultimate happiness of nirvana to all beings. And yes, as Shantideva says, and all worldly happiness on the way. We need that too. We need to give that too. So I offer this Dharma talk in honour of Dr Ambedkar, especially Dr. Bodhisattva Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. I offer it for my brothers and sisters in India. I offer it to all of you who are listening, including all 17 of you here at Padmavajra listening. May we all partake of the feast of the Dharma, and may we give that feast to all beings. Jai Bhim, Namo Buddhaya.